You ever hear what $1 billion sounds like when it's barely holding itself together? It's not loud, not dramatic. It's a low, constant hum like a swarm of mechanical bees trapped inside steel walls, fighting to stay alive. That's the sound I've lived with for the past 15 years. And if you're curious about how that sound turned into silence and how one arrogant decision could bring an entire empire crashing down overnight, then go ahead and hit that like button. Don't forget to tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, I guess it's time I properly introduce myself. My name is Lucinda Price. I'm 45 years old, and I run operations at a data center just outside Midland, Texas. Or at least, I used to run it. The place is called Red Grid Systems. From the outside, it looks like nothing, just a long, dull warehouse baking under the Texas sun. But inside is where everything happens. Hospital records, emergency dispatch backups, energy grid monitoring, systems that people don't think about until they fail. And when they fail, people don't just get inconvenienced, they get hurt. 15 years ago, when I first walked into Red Grid, it was barely functional. Old servers, faulty wiring, a mess of shortcuts and neglect. But then came the blackout, the one that shut down half the state. Power grids collapsed, hospitals struggled to stay online, and chaos spread faster than the heat. My boss, Gerald Whitaker, was on a beach somewhere, sipping cocktails. I was here. I slept next to diesel generators for 3 nights straight. I rerouted power manually, rewired switches with shaking hands, and kept those servers alive when they should have died. When the dust settled, Red Grid was one of the only facilities still standing. That's when the contracts started pouring in. And that's when I became something more than just an employee. I became the one thing holding it all together. You should know this story is fictional, shaped with a touch of AI to make it more vivid and engaging. Still, I believe you'll feel every emotion and take away something meaningful from it. Now, let's continue. I didn't become the backbone of Red Grid Systems because someone handed me the title. I became it the hard way through sleepless nights, bad decisions under pressure, and one disaster that changed everything. 15 years ago, this place was barely worth locking the doors at night. Rusted server racks, tangled cables, outdated cooling units that rattled like they were about to give up at any second. Back then, I was just another technician trying to keep things from falling apart long enough to get paid. Then the blackout hit. If you lived in Texas long enough, you remember it. The grid collapsed like it had been waiting for an excuse. Air conditioners died in the middle of summer heat. Hospitals scrambled for backup power, and people started realizing just how fragile everything really was. Gerald Whitaker, the owner of Red Grid, was nowhere to be found. Later, I learned he was on a private trip in Cabo, unreachable, probably thinking the whole thing would sort itself out. It didn't. I was the one standing in that server hall when the power dropped. Everything went dark except the emergency lights. The generators hesitated, coughed, then kicked in like an old engine, refusing to die. But they weren't stable, not yet. I grabbed a flashlight and ran, for 3 straight days. I didn't leave the building. I dragged fuel drums across concrete floors, manually fed diesel into backup systems, and monitored temperatures like my life depended on it. Because in a way, it did. If those servers overheated, data would be gone. If the systems failed, people would suffer. At one point, the cooling system started to give out. The temperature climbed so fast I could feel it through my boots. I remember kneeling on the floor, tools scattered around me, rewiring a control panel with sweat dripping into my eyes. I didn't have time to think. I just fixed what was in front of me and moved to the next thing before it broke. When the main grid finally came back online, Red Grid was still standing, not just standing, running. That's when everything changed. The county noticed first. Their emergency dispatch backups had stayed online the entire time. Calls had gone through when other systems failed. Then the regional hospital network reached out. They needed a place to store patient records that wouldn't collapse under pressure. After that came the refinery outside town, the the one dealing with volatile chemicals that couldn't afford even a second of system failure. Contracts started coming in faster than we could process them. Gerald came back just in time to take credit. He walked through the facility like he'd built it with his own hands, shaking hands, signing deals, smiling for people who never knew whose fingerprints were actually on the work. I didn't argue. I didn't need recognition, at least. That's what I told myself back then, because I knew the truth. Every cable under that floor, every backup system, every workaround that kept things stable, I built it. Not with money, but with time, with stress, with pieces of my life I never got back. Red Grid didn't become essential because of strategy. It became essential because I refused to let it fail. The morning everything shifted felt strangely ordinary. Outside, a storm gathered over Midland, clouds thick and heavy like something waiting to break. Inside Red Grid systems, everything was stable, temperature steady, systems quiet, the kind of calm that only exists when everything is under control. I moved through the server aisles, checking indicators, listening to the familiar hum that had guided me for years. Nothing was out of place. Nothing warned me that, by the end of the day, I wouldn't be the one in control anymore. "Lucinda!" Marcus called from behind me. "He's here." I paused. Gerald Whitaker rarely showed up without a reason. "Alone?" I asked. Marcus shook his head. "No. He brought his son." That told me everything. Ethan Whitaker. Fresh degree, polished confidence, and no real experience, the last time I saw him. He nearly compromised a secure system because he thought he knew better. I turned toward the conference room, already feeling the tension building in my chest. Inside, Gerald sat at the head of the table, smiling like he was about to deliver good news. Ethan sat beside him, relaxed, scrolling through his phone. The rest of the team filled in quietly, avoiding eye contact. "Lucinda." "There you are," Gerald said. "Take a seat." I did. Arms crossed, waiting. Gerald clapped his hands once. "Let's get started. Red Grid is growing fast, and it's time we evolve. We need fresh thinking, new leadership." He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "My son has just completed his MBA. He's bringing modern strategy, new ideas, a vision for scaling this company." Ethan finally looked up, giving a confident smile. I stayed silent. "Effective immediately." Gerald continued. "Ethan will take over as director of operations." The room went still. My position, just like that. I felt the weight of 15 years press against my chest, but I didn't react. I just looked at Ethan. "We're going to optimize things," he said casually. "Streamline processes, modernize infrastructure, unlock potential." Unlock? I almost laughed. "This system doesn't need reinvention," I said evenly. "It needs stability." He shook his head slightly. "That's outdated thinking." Gerald stepped in quickly. "Now? Lucinda, don't take this the wrong way. You've been incredible, truly. But it's time to move forward. I already knew what was coming next. You're not going anywhere," he added. "We still need you here." Of course they did, just not where I belonged. I leaned back slightly, studying both of them, one blinded by pride, the other drowning in confidence he hadn't earned, and for the first time in years. I felt something shift inside me. Not panic, not anger. Something colder, because I realized they had just handed control of a fragile system to someone who didn't understand it, and they expected me to watch. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. That was the part that surprised them the most. "All right," I said, my tone steady, almost calm. "If that's the direction you want." Gerald blinked, clearly expecting resistance. Ethan barely reacted, already half checked out of the conversation, like the decision had nothing to do with reality. "That's the spirit," Gerald said quickly. Relieved. "I knew you'd understand. We value loyalty here." Loyalty! I almost smiled at the word. Ethan leaned forward slightly, finally giving me his full attention. "We're not removing you. Lucinda, we're repositioning you. There it was. To what exactly, I asked. Gerald slid a folder across the table toward me. Cheap paper, fresh from the printer, senior compliance archivist, he said. I looked down at the title, letting the words settle. Archivist, paperwork, documentation, filing, everything that happens after the real work is done. You'll handle audits, records, documentation? Ethan added casually. We need your institutional knowledge documented properly. Get it out of your head and into systems we can scale. Institutional knowledge. That's what they called 15 years of experience now. You want me to write everything down? I said, exactly. Ethan replied. So we're not dependent on any one person. Not dependent. The meaning was clear. Gerald leaned in, lowering his voice like he was offering something generous. This is important work. Lucinda, critical, even. You'll help Ethan get up to speed. Make sure everything looks clean for audits. Looks clean. I could feel something tightening in my chest, but I kept my face neutral. So I handle paperwork, I said. And support operations, Ethan corrected. From a strategic distance. Strategic distance. That meant out of the way. I glanced around the room. Marcus avoided my eyes. Sarah stared at the table. Everyone understood what was happening, but no one said a word. Compensation will be adjusted, Gerald added, almost as an afterthought. Aligned with your new responsibilities. There it was. Not just a demotion, a pay cut. I nodded once, slowly, as if I were processing it like any other operational change. Okay, I said. The word felt strange in my mouth, but it landed exactly how I intended. Gerald exhaled in relief. Good. I knew we could count on you. Ethan stood up, already done with the conversation. Great. Just email me a summary of what you used to handle. Keep it concise. Bullet points. Used to handle. I looked at him for a second longer than necessary. Then I nodded again. Of course. The meeting ended like nothing important had happened. Chairs moved, papers shuffled, people avoided looking at me as they filed out. Gerald and Ethan left together, already talking about lunch plans and investor calls. I stayed seated for a moment. Then I picked up the folder and walked out. My new office was at the back of the building, near the loading dock, a converted storage room with no windows. The air smelled faintly of diesel and dust. A folding table sat in the center, paired with a worn-out chair that looked like it had been pulled from a break room years ago. This was where they thought I belonged now. I set the folder down and sat. For a long moment. I just listened. Through the walls. I could still hear it. The hum of the servers. The rhythm I had memorized over years. It was still there. Still running on everything I had built, just no longer under my control. I opened the folder. Job description, Senior Compliance Archivist. The duties were exactly what I expected. Organize records, digitize logs, assist the director, maintain documentation, assist the director. I let out a quiet breath. 15 years of keeping systems alive reduced to filing papers for someone who didn't understand them. A tear threatened to form, but I shut it down immediately. That wasn't how I handled problems. I fixed them. But this wasn't something I could fix the usual way, because the people making the decisions didn't understand the system. And worse, they didn't understand the risk. My phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. He's asking for admin access. Says he wants full control. I stared at the screen for a moment. Instinct told me to walk back in there and stop him, to protect the system, to fix it. But then I looked back at the folder on the desk. Senior Compliance Archivist? Paperwork? That's what they wanted from me. I typed my response slowly. Give him what he asks for. Document everything. I hit send and leaned back in the chair. If they wanted control, they could have it, every bit of it. I didn't go back to the server floor. Instead, I stayed exactly where they put me, in that cramped, airless room they now called my office, surrounded by boxes no one had touched in years. At first, I just stared at them. Old records, Forgotten paperwork? The kind of things companies keep because they have to, not because anyone expects to ever need them again. Then I remembered something Ethan had said. Get it out of your head and into systems we can scale. He wanted documentation. Fine. I stood up, walked over to the nearest box, and pulled it open. Dust lifted into the air, catching the weak fluorescent light. Inside were thick binders, each labeled in faded ink, federal filings, insurance agreements, compliance reports, the foundation of everything Red Grid claimed to be. I pulled one out at random. FEMA Infrastructure Grant, 2011. That was from the rebuild after the blackout. I flipped it open, scanning quickly at first. Standard language, funding terms, upgrade requirements. Then I slowed down. Page 4. A clause buried in dense legal text. Continued eligibility is contingent upon the active oversight of a certified master infrastructure operator. My fingers paused on the page. Designated as the primary responsible party for system reliability and emergency response. Below it, typed clearly, with no room for interpretation, Lucinda Price. My name. I leaned back slightly, feeling something shift in my chest. That wasn't just a reference. That was a condition. I reached for another binder. Insurance policy, medical data hosting agreement. I flipped through until I found the relevant section. Coverage is valid only under supervision of a certified operator with no less than 10 years of direct operational experience in high-risk data environments. Again, Lucinda Price. Every critical system they insured, every high-risk contract, every liability clause, all of it pointed back to me. I grabbed another file, state certification, critical infrastructure designation, same structure, same requirement, same name. I sat down slowly, the worn chair creaking beneath me. They didn't just rely on my experience. They had built the entire legal structure of the company around it. My qualifications weren't just useful, they were mandatory. I went still, letting that realization settle fully. By removing me from operations, they hadn't just made a bad management decision. They had violated the core conditions of their own contracts, and they didn't even realize it. I let out a slow breath. The kind that comes when everything suddenly makes sense. Gerald thought ownership meant control. Ethan thought authority meant understanding. Neither of them had ever read the fine print that actually kept the business alive. I pulled more documents from the boxes. Flipping through faster now. EPA, permits for the generators. My certification, emergency response protocols. My authorization, client agreements tied to system uptime. My oversight. It was everywhere. A web of legal obligations, all anchored to one assumption, that I was the one in charge. I leaned back again, staring at the ceiling. They hadn't replaced me. They had removed the one requirement that made everything valid, and they were still operating as if nothing had changed. A quiet laugh slipped out before I could stop it. Not loud, not emotional, just clear. Because, for the first time since that meeting, I wasn't thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what they had just broken, and the best part, they had done it themselves. All I had to do now was document it. I didn't rush. That was the difference between panic and control. For 15 years, my instinct had always been the same. If something was wrong, I fixed it. If a system failed, I stepped in before it collapsed. That reflex was built into me, hardwired from too many nights spent keeping everything alive. But this time, fixing it would mean saving them, and they had just made it very clear they didn't want me in charge. So I sat there in that cramped room, surrounded by binders and forgotten paperwork, and let a different kind of thinking take over. Cold, precise, patient. I pulled a blank notebook from the drawer and set it on the desk. The paper was cheap, thin, the kind that tears too easily. It didn't matter. It would hold what I needed. At the top of the first page, I wrote a single phrase, documentation log. Then I paused, pen hovering just above the paper. If I was going to do this, it had to be clean, no sabotage, no shortcuts, no reckless moves that could come back on me. I wasn't going to break the system. I was going to let them break it themselves, and I would make sure every step was recorded. I wrote the first entry, Day 1. Operational authority transferred to Ethan Whitaker. No formal notification issued to regulatory bodies. Simple, factual, verifiable. I closed the notebook and leaned back, thinking through the rest. Step 1 was already done. The transfer of power had happened, and they hadn't reported it. That alone was enough to trigger scrutiny if anyone looked closely. Step 2 was the hardest. Let Ethan be Ethan. That meant watching him make decisions I knew were wrong, letting changes go through that I would have blocked without hesitation, standing still while systems drifted toward failure. Every instinct in my body resisted that idea. But I understood something now that I hadn't before. If I kept fixing things, they would never see the damage, and when the system finally failed, they would still blame me. No, if this was going to end, it needed to end with clarity. I picked up my phone and opened the message thread with Marcus. He's going to start making changes. I typed, "Do not override anything unless you get it in writing." The reply came quickly. "Lucinda, he doesn't know what he's doing." "I know," I answered. "That's why we document." There was a long pause before the next message. "This is going to go bad." I stared at the screen for a second. Then I typed the only honest answer I had. "Yes." I set the phone down and opened my laptop. If I was going to build a case, I needed more than handwritten notes. I created a new file, title Operational Transition Record. Then I started outlining time-stamped events, system changes, authorization requests, deviations from standard protocols, everything that could be traced back to a decision made after I was removed. No opinions, just facts. The kind that lawyers understand, the kind regulators don't ignore. Hours passed without me noticing. Outside the room, I could hear the distant hum of the servers shifting slightly, the rhythm no longer as steady as it used to be. Small changes, barely noticeable to anyone else, but not to me. I knew exactly what those changes meant, and I wrote them down. Every adjustment, every override, every time someone followed Ethan's instructions instead of established procedure. By the time I stopped, the file had already grown longer than I expected, and this was just the beginning. I closed the laptop slowly, letting the weight of what I was doing settle in. I wasn't fighting them. I wasn't stopping them. I was building a record of everything they chose to do, and when the time came, that record would speak for itself, because systems don't collapse all at once. They fail piece by piece, decision by decision. And now, for the first time, I wasn't the one holding it together. I was the one watching it unfold, and making sure nothing went unnoticed. The first mistake didn't come with alarms. It came quietly, like most bad decisions do. I noticed it the moment I stepped out of my office and glanced at the monitoring screen mounted on the wall near the control room. The numbers were subtle, just a few degrees higher than usual, but to me, it felt like someone had changed the rhythm of a heartbeat. Temperature set, 78 degrees Fahrenheit. For 15 years. We ran that floor at 68, not because it was comfortable, but because it was safe. Our equipment wasn't built for experimentation. It was a mix of aging infrastructure and critical systems that didn't tolerate fluctuations. I walked into the control room, slow and steady. Ethan stood near the console, holding a small espresso cup like he belonged in a glass office somewhere. "Not here. Why is the temperature set to 78? I asked. He didn't even turn around immediately, just took a sip before answering. "Efficiency," he said. "I've been reviewing industry benchmarks. We're overcooling. It's a waste of money." I looked at the screen again, then back at him. "This isn't a test environment," I said. "Those servers aren't designed for higher thermal ranges. Some of them will fail under sustained heat." He finally faced me. Calm, almost amused. "Major companies run hotter," he replied. "It's standard now. We're just catching up. They design their systems for that." I said, "We don't." He shrugged. The sensors will alert us if anything goes wrong. That sentence told me everything I needed to know. I pulled my notebook from my pocket. 9:12 a.m. Temperature increased to 78 degrees by Director Ethan Whitaker. Change made against existing operational standards. I wrote it down clearly, slowly. He watched me, slightly confused. "You're really writing that?" he asked. "Yes." He gave a small laugh. "You're taking this archivist thing seriously." I didn't answer, because that wasn't the real problem. The real problem came later that afternoon. I was back in my office, scanning old compliance files, when I felt it, a vibration through the floor. Deep, rhythmic, familiar, generator test cycle, every week, like clockwork. The backup generators ran a load test to ensure they were ready in case of a power failure. It was one of the most critical routines we had. Then suddenly, the vibration stopped, not gradually, abruptly. I froze. That wasn't how the system shut down. I stood up, instinct kicking in before I could stop it, but I didn't move. 2 minutes later, the door burst open. Marcus stood there, pale. He shut it off. He said, "Who?" I asked, even though I already knew. "Ethan." He went outside and hit the emergency stop on generator 3 for a second. I just stared at him. "Why?" He said it was too loud. Marcus replied, "He was on a call, said we don't need to run them every week." I closed my eyes briefly. "Emergency stop. On a live cycle. That engine needs a cool-down period," I said quietly. "If you shut it down like that, you risk damaging the internal components," I told him. Marcus said, "He said we're overdoing maintenance." Of course he did. I walked back to my desk and sat down. "Did you log it?" I asked. Marcus shook his head. "I came straight to you." I nodded once. "Go log it." I said, exact details, time, action, reason. He didn't move. "Lucinda, this could break the system." I met his eyes. "I know." There was a long silence between us. "You're not going to fix it?" he asked. The question hung in the air. 15 years of instinct told me to get up, walk out there, and correct everything before it got worse. But that wasn't my role anymore. I looked back down at the notebook. "Log it." I repeated. Marcus hesitated, then turned and left. I sat there, hands resting on the desk, listening. The hum of the system had changed. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough for me to know exactly what was coming, and for the first time. I didn't reach out to stop it. I just picked up my pen and wrote everything down. By the time I closed my notebook, the system was already drifting, not failing, not yet, but drifting in ways that only someone who had lived inside it could feel. That was the difference between numbers on a screen and reality. Most people waited for alerts. I never needed them. I could hear when something was wrong. And now, I could hear it starting. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment, letting the next step settle in my mind. Documentation wasn't enough. Records mattered, but records only worked after something broke. If I wanted this to unfold the way it needed to, the right people had to know before the collapse. Not as a warning, as a fact. I reached for my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't needed to call in months. Daniel Reeves, facilities director for the regional hospital network. We'd worked together for years. He trusted me because I never gave him problems, only solutions. I pressed call. He picked up on the second ring. "Lucinda," he said, his voice warm. "Didn't expect to hear from you today? Everything good over there?" I smiled slightly at the question. "Everything's operational," I said. "I just needed to confirm your escalation contacts. Updating records, same as always." He replied, "Call me first, then loop in the CIO if it's serious." "Got it," I said. Then I paused, just long enough to make the next part feel natural. "Also, just so you're aware, I've been moved out of direct operations." There was a brief silence. "What do you mean?" Daniel asked. "Internal restructuring," I said calmly. I'm handling compliance and documentation now. Operational oversight has been reassigned. To who he asked. Ethan Whitaker. Another pause. Longer this time. The owner's son, he said carefully. Yes. And you're not reviewing system alerts anymore. No, I answered. All alerts route directly to him now. I'm not in that chain. The silence on the other end turned heavy. Daniel wasn't the type to panic, but he understood risk. Lucinda, he said slowly. You've been our primary contact for years. I'm aware. I replied. And you're telling me you're no longer overseeing uptime or emergency response. That's correct. He exhaled quietly. That changes things. I didn't respond, because it was supposed to, after a moment. He spoke again. Voice sharper now. Are there any operational changes we should be concerned about? I let a small pause sit between us. Temperature thresholds have been adjusted, I said, and generator test cycles may be modified for efficiency. Another silence. He's changing maintenance cycles, Daniel asked. That's the direction, I said. I could almost hear him thinking. Hospitals don't gamble with infrastructure. They don't accept efficiency when lives depend on consistency. All right, he said finally. Thanks for letting me know. Of course, I replied, just keeping records updated. We hung up? I set the phone down slowly. That was all it took. No accusations, no warnings, just information. The kind that forces people to start asking questions. I turned back to my laptop and added a new entry. External stakeholder notified of operational transition. Confirmation received. Simple, clean, traceable. I leaned back again, listening to the distant hum beyond the walls. Somewhere in the building, Ethan was still making decisions, still believing he was improving things. He had no idea what I had just set in motion, because systems like this don't fail in isolation. They're connected to clients, to regulators, to contracts built on assumptions that no longer held true. And once those connections started to shift, everything else would follow. I picked up my pen again, tapping it lightly against the desk. The first mistake had already been made. Now the reaction had begun. All I had done was remove the silence and let the right people hear what was really happening. By Friday, the building felt different, not broken, not yet, but strained. The air carried a faint smell of heat and overworked components. The servers were louder, fans pushing harder than they should, trying to compensate for decisions they were never designed to handle. I was at my desk, scanning old compliance logs, when the door to my office swung open without warning. Gerald Whitaker stepped in, adjusting his cufflinks like he owned every inch of air in the room. Lucinda, he said, forcing a smile. We need a quick favor. I didn't stand. What kind of favor? He walked over and placed a stack of documents on my desk. Thick, flagged, urgent, routine certification. He said, fire suppression system, safety compliance, all standard. Just needs your signature. I looked down at the papers. State certification forms, liability confirmations, operational oversight declarations, all tied to one thing. The responsible operator, me. You want me to sign this? I said slowly. Of course. Gerald replied. You're still licensed. It's just paperwork. Just paperwork. I flipped through the pages carefully, reading line by line, every clause, every condition. If I sign this, I said, I'm confirming that I oversee the system. Gerald waved a hand dismissively. You're still here, aren't you? Same difference? No, I said, looking up at him. Not the same. His smile tightened. Lucinda, don't make this complicated. We've got investors coming in Monday. Everything needs to be clean. Clean. That word again. I tapped the paper lightly with my finger. Has the fire system been inspected this quarter? I asked. Yes, he said quickly. By who? A pause. Vendor. He said. We've got someone handling it. I already knew the answer. I had checked the records. The original contractor had been dropped. replaced with a cheaper service that had no certification for high-capacity suppression systems. If I signed this, I would be confirming a system I knew wasn't properly maintained. If something failed, it wouldn't be Gerald facing charges. It would be me. You're asking me to take legal responsibility for a system I no longer control. I said, "You're being dramatic." Gerald snapped, "It's a form. It's a liability statement." The room went quiet. For a moment. He just stared at me, the polite mask slipping. "After everything I've done for you," he said, voice lower now. "You're really going to push back on this?" I held his gaze. "This isn't about favors," I said. "This is about accountability." He leaned forward slightly, frustration creeping in. "Sign it," he said. I picked up the pen. For a second. I just held it there. Then I set it back down. "I need time to review." I said, "You wrote half of this." He snapped. "And now I'm not in charge of it," I replied calmly. He exhaled sharply, clearly annoyed. "Fine," he said. "Have it on my desk by 4. Then he turned and walked out. The moment the door closed, the room felt heavier. I looked back at the papers. They weren't asking for help. They were asking for protection, and they expected me to give it without question. I pulled my laptop closer and opened a new email. Recipient State Fire Marshal Office. Subject update on responsible operator status. I stared at the screen for a moment, choosing my words carefully, clear, direct, unmistakable. I am writing to formally notify that I am no longer serving in an operational capacity at Red Grid Systems. I detailed the change in my role. The removal of authority. The lack of oversight. No emotion. Just facts. Because facts trigger action. I read it once more. Then hit send. That was it. No going back. I looked at the stack of papers again. Slowly, I picked them up, and instead of signing, I fed them into the shredder beside my desk. The machine hummed as the pages disappeared. One by one. Quiet. Final. I leaned back in my chair, listening, somewhere beyond the walls. The system kept running, unaware of what had just been set in motion. But it wouldn't stay that way for long, because this time, the pressure wasn't coming from inside the building, it was coming from outside, and it was getting closer. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I drove past the edge of town, to a place where the power lines cut across a wide stretch of water. Tall steel towers stood in perfect lines, carrying electricity across miles like nothing could ever stop it. I sat on the hood of my car and watched the red lights blinking at the top of each tower. Slow, steady, predictable. Unlike everything back at Red Grid, my phone buzzed in my hand. A message. "Daniel, we need to talk. In person. No details. No questions. Just that." I checked the time. Late. Too late for anything casual. Where I replied, "Waffle House, 6 a.m. I stared at the screen for a moment, then smiled faintly. Of course it was Waffle House. The kind of place where real decisions get made without paperwork. The next morning, I walked in just as the sun was starting to rise. The place smelled like coffee, grease, and something familiar. The kind of place that doesn't pretend to be anything it's not. Daniel was already there. He wasn't alone. A woman sat across from him, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit that didn't belong in a place like this. Calm posture, focused eyes, the kind of person who didn't waste time. "Lucinda," Daniel said, nodding toward the booth. "This is Victoria Hale." I slid into the seat. "Victoria represents Northbridge Infrastructure," he added. I raised an eyebrow slightly. "Infrastructure fund." That wasn't small. Victoria didn't smile. She just studied me for a second. "I've heard a lot about you," she said. "Mostly from people who don't make mistakes twice." I took that as a compliment. "What do you want?" I asked. Direct was better. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "If Red Grid loses operational compliance," he said, The hospital network has a clause. We can terminate immediately and transfer services. I know, I replied. Victoria continued. We're building a new facility, 5 miles from Red Grid, Tier 4 standard, fully funded. But we don't have someone who understands the local grid the way you do. There it was. I stayed quiet. We don't just need an operator, she added. We need someone who can run the entire system. I looked down at the table for a moment, tracing a faint scratch in the surface. 15 years. Everything I built. Everything I kept alive. And now, they were offering me something new, something clean. When I asked, construction is underway, Victoria said. We're planning to go live in 2 months. 2 months. Too slow. That's not going to work, I said. Daniel frowned slightly. What do you mean I'm not waiting 2 months? I replied. If I do this, I start immediately. Victoria leaned back slightly. Considering you'd leave Red Grid now, she asked. I already have. I said. That wasn't entirely true yet. But it would be. Daniel exchanged a glance with her. Lucinda, he said carefully. If this escalates the way we think it will, Red Grid won't have much time. I know, I said. Victoria tapped her fingers lightly against the table. What would you need? She asked. Control. I answered. Full operational authority. No interference. Done, she said without hesitation. I nodded once. And I bring my team. I added. Marcus, Sarah, anyone I trust. Another pause. Then Victoria nodded. Done. I exhaled slowly, feeling something inside me shift, for the first time in days. It wasn't tension. It was clarity. Daniel leaned back, studying me. You're serious about this? He said, Yes. He hesitated for a second. Then you should know, he added. Our legal team is already reviewing the compliance issue. If your name is no longer tied to operations, they'll act. I finished. Yes. I nodded. That's the point. Victoria's expression changed slightly. Not surprised. Impressed? Monday, she said. We'll be ready. I stood up. So will I. As I walked out of the Waffle House, the early morning air felt different, lighter, behind me. A system was still running, but it was no longer mine. And ahead of me, something new was already taking shape. All that was left now was to let everything fall into place. Monday arrived with a kind of artificial brightness that didn't belong to the situation. The parking lot at Red Grid Systems was full before 8. Black sedans, rental SUVs, polished shoes stepping onto cracked concrete. Investors had arrived. People who had never touched a server in their lives were about to decide the future of a system they barely understood. Inside, everything looked staged. The conference room had been cleaned, polished, arranged to impress. Screens ready, slides prepared, coffee set out like it could distract from reality. Gerald Whitaker moved through the room like a man trying to outrun something he couldn't see yet, adjusting his tie, checking his watch, forcing conversations that didn't quite land. Ethan stood near the front, flipping through slides on his laptop, confident, focused, completely unaware. I took a seat at the back of the room. Not part of the presentation, not part of the leadership, just the archivist, exactly where they had put me. The meeting started. Ethan stood up, straightened his jacket, and began. Gentlemen, welcome, he said, voice steady. Today, we're going to talk about the future of Red Grid Systems. He clicked to the first slide. Charts, numbers, projected savings. By optimizing our infrastructure, he continued, we've already reduced operational costs significantly in the past week. A week. That was how long it took to undo 15 years. One of the investors raised a hand. Your thermal readings, he said. They're higher than industry standards for mixed hardware environments. How are you managing risk? Ethan smiled. Legacy sensors, he said smoothly. We're upgrading them. I watched him closely. No hesitation, no understanding, just confidence. Another investor spoke. And your generator maintenance cycle. We see reduced fuel usage. We've streamlined testing. Ethan replied. More efficient scheduling. Efficient. That word again. Then the door opened. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to stop everything. A man stepped inside, wearing a blue jacket with an official badge clipped to the front. Behind him, another man, and behind them, a third holding a folder. The room went quiet. Gerald Whitaker, the first man said. Gerald froze. Yes, he replied. We're in the middle of, I'm with the state fire marshal's office. The man interrupted. We received notification that your certified operator is no longer in an active operational role. Silence. Heavy. Immediate. You are currently running a critical infrastructure facility without a licensed supervisor. He continued. That puts you in violation of state regulations. Gerald looked at Ethan, then at me, then back at the man. There's been a misunderstanding, he said quickly. Lucinda is right here. She's still part of the company. All eyes turned toward me. I stood up slowly, every movement deliberate. Lucinda, Gerald said, his voice tight. Tell him. I met his eyes. Then I looked at the inspector. My role is administrative. I said clearly, I no longer have operational authority or oversight. The words landed harder than anything else in the room. Ethan's expression changed, for the first time. Uncertainty. That's not Gerald started. It is, I said calmly. It's in my job description, signed by both of you. The inspector nodded once. Then you are non-compliant, he said. Effective immediately. A folder hit the table. Your facility is to cease operations until a certified operator is reinstated and approved. One of the investors stood up. Does this affect contract stability? He asked. Another voice answered before Gerald could. Yes, came Daniel's voice from the doorway. He stepped inside. Calm. Composed. This constitutes a breach of our agreement, he said. We are terminating service effective immediately. The words echoed. Termination. Immediate. The room shifted. Investors gathering their things. Quiet conversations turning sharp. Phones coming out. Gerald's face drained of color. You can't do that, Ethan said, his voice cracking. We have contracts. Had. Daniel corrected. Everything unraveled at once. Not slowly. Not gradually. All at once. The system they thought they controlled collapsed under the weight of its own violations. I stood there for a moment longer, watching it happen, no anger, no satisfaction, just clarity. Then I turned and walked out. Behind me, voices rose, arguments, panic, desperation. But none of it mattered anymore, because the moment they removed the one thing holding it all together, this ending became inevitable. The walk from that conference room to the parking lot felt longer than it ever had before. 50 yards, maybe less. But for the first time in 15 years, I wasn't walking toward a problem that needed fixing. I was walking away. Behind me. Red Grid Systems was unraveling faster than anyone inside that building could control. The hum I had lived with for so long would soon fade, replaced by silence they didn't know how to handle. I stopped briefly at my locker. Inside, there wasn't much. A spare pair of gloves, a worn-out notebook, a photo of my father I'd kept tucked in the corner for years. 15 years of work, reduced to a small cardboard box. Marcus was waiting near the exit, holding one of his own. You really did it, he said quietly. No, I replied, closing the locker. They did. He let out a breath that sounded like relief more than anything else. Where to now? He asked. I looked toward the open parking lot, sunlight reflecting off rows of cars that didn't belong to this place anymore. Somewhere that actually knows what it's doing. I said. We stepped outside together. The air felt different. Lighter. Cleaner. As I reached my truck. I glanced back once, for a moment. I could almost see it the way it used to be, stable, reliable, built on systems that made sense. Then the lights flickered. Just once. That was enough. I got in, started the engine, and drove away. By Tuesday morning, I was standing inside a different facility. New floors, new systems, clean infrastructure built with intention instead of patchwork. Every component designed to work together, not held together by experience and instinct alone. Victoria Hale stood beside me, reviewing the initial setup. "Welcome to North Bridge," she said. I nodded, taking in the room. "This is yours," she added. "Full operational control. No hesitation, no conditions, just responsibility." Marcus had already joined the team. Sarah came later that week, piece by piece. The people who actually understood the work found their way here, and the systems responded. Stable temperatures, proper maintenance cycles, clear accountability, no shortcuts, no guesses, just control. Within 3 months, North Bridge had absorbed most of Red Grid's former clients. The transition was quiet, almost effortless, because the infrastructure didn't change. The people behind it did. As for Red Grid, it didn't last. Contracts collapsed. Funding disappeared. Without compliance. Without trust. The entire structure gave out exactly the way it was always going to. Last I heard, the building had been sold, empty, repurposed, just another warehouse. Gerald Whitaker vanished from the industry. Ethan tried to rebrand himself somewhere else, talking about strategy and innovation like none of this had ever happened. But systems don't forget, and neither do the people who rely on them. As for me, I stood in the control room of North Bridge, watching the monitors glow steady and green. Everything balanced, everything working. The hum was still there, but now, it wasn't fragile, it was controlled. I rested my hand lightly on the console, feeling the vibration beneath my fingers. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't holding something together that was about to break. I was running something built to last. And this time, no one was taking that control away from me. Looking back, I didn't win because I destroyed anything. I won because I understood what mattered, and I refused to betray it. Through this story, I learned 3 important lessons. First, never let anyone reduce your value to something replaceable when you know you are the foundation holding everything together. If you don't respect your own worth, someone else will always try to rewrite it for you. Second, competence will always outlast arrogance. People can fake confidence, titles, and authority, but when real pressure comes, only true skill and experience can keep things standing. And third, sometimes the strongest move isn't to fight back immediately, but to step back, stay calm, and let truth expose itself. Not every battle needs noise. Some victories come from clarity and patience. Now I'm curious which lesson left the deepest impression on you. I'd really like to hear your thoughts, because every perspective adds value to this community we're building together. If this story gave you something to think about, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Leave a comment, share your view. And if you think someone else could learn from this, share the video with them. You're not just watching, you're part of a group that grows stronger by learning from every story.
Welcome to Boardroom Revenge Stories, a channel focused on workplace conflict, corporate betrayal, power struggles, and quiet justice. Our stories follow a structured workflow to deliver a consistent, immersive experience. We start by analyzing real discussions on Reddit, Facebook, Quora, and blogs. Next, we craft original scripts using AI tools like ChatGPT. We then use 11 Labs to transform text into high-quality voice and edit everything in CapCut for a smooth, cinematic finish. Thumbnails are designed with Canva, and every video is carefully reviewed before release. These stories go beyond entertainment, revealing how power truly works and how justice quietly unfolds.